The air grew heavier as we approached the heart of the Chaos Forge world, a place where promethium smoke hung thick, and the ground vibrated with the echoes of engines no sane mind should ever hear. From here, the girls saw not merely machinery but a living system of metal and fire, feeding on the despair and ignorance of those who had tried to control it. I could feel it in my chest, the tension, the fear, and something darker, whispering in a voice only Mara seemed able to understand. The closer we moved, the more the reality of the place pressed down on us. The overseers were no longer just men. They were monstrous parodies of humanity, their bodies twisted and augmented with the gifts of chaos, their eyes glowing with devotion to powers we had been warned about in stories, but never truly understood until now. And yet, in the shadows, Mara and the others moved with a grace that belied their size. They had learned to see beyond the surface, to sense the patterns that adults could not, and the Forge rewarded that vision. We slipped past molten vats and spinning cogwork that could crush a dozen men in seconds. Every pulse of energy through the floor vibrated in our bones. Every hiss of promethium carried a whisper of warning. The girls began to recognize the rhythm of the core, the heart of corruption that both sustained the Forge and threatened to consume it. It was alive, yes, but also wounded, hungry for control, and it was at that hunger that we aimed to strike. The first clash came without warning. A chaos-enhanced technician turned, spotting Mara as she touched the conduits. His movements were swift, deadly, but she had learned the Forge's secrets. The others followed her lead, creating distractions with small acts of cleverness, nudges, and misdirection. Sparks flew, engines groaned, and the grotesque man staggered, overwhelmed not by brute strength, but by the ingenuity of children who had nothing left to lose. Mara's small hand pressed against a control glyph, and the core pulsed in response. For the first time, it felt as though the machine itself was fighting alongside us. Deeper still, the corruption grew more tangible. Shadows thickened, voices whispered, and the environment itself seemed eager to test us. Yet within that chaos, Mara shone. She was no longer just one of us. She was becoming a force of her own making. Every girl followed, but it was her courage and clarity that guided our small feet across a terrain that had swallowed men whole. And then we saw it. The heart, a massive construct of warped metal and pulsating energy, its center swirling with colors that made our eyes ache. It was impossible, wrong, beautiful in a way that set every instinct on edge. The adults, the monsters, the overseers, they had all feared it, and yet it bent to Mara's presence. She stepped closer, unafraid, and for the first time, the Forge responded fully, thrumming in acknowledgement. It was not yet victory. The path forward was narrow, and the eyes of corruption were upon us. But we had learned the patterns. We had learned each other. And for the first time, I believed that a child, small in body but immense in courage, could alter the course of a world built for fear and pain. The closer Mara drew to the heart of the Forge, the more the world itself seemed to resist. Every footfall vibrated through the molten floors. Every breath was thick with the metallic taste of fear and oil. The shadows writhed with intent, whispering promises of power, of surrender, of annihilation. Yet Mara walked forward as though guided by some instinct older than the Forge, her small hands brushing against conduits that screamed with energy too immense to hold. The girls followed, hearts pounding, hands trembling, but eyes wide with the clarity of understanding that only the young can have. Fear is not always to be obeyed. The first of the overseers tried to strike again. Towering figures, their bodies warped with chaos, swung heavy implements meant to crush any adult with ease. But Mara ducked, rolled, and with a calculated motion she activated a pressure valve. Steam erupted, scalding and choking, forcing the monstrosity back. The others scattered, moving with surprising coordination, a rhythm born of necessity and unspoken trust. What adults had failed to predict, the unpredictability of children, their refusal to be entirely contained, the forge could not adjust to. And then came the pulse. A wave of corruption that bent the light, that made the very air taste of iron and ash. The heart recognized Mara, or perhaps the pattern she embodied. It throbbed in response, a living thing acknowledging another. The floor beneath our feet shivered. Sparks flew from conduits, licking the walls with tongues of fire. Yet Mara pressed on, her small frame undeterred by the chaos. She reached the control nexus, a twisted altar of metal and bone fused with the machinery. Here, the whispers of the forge rose to a roar, voices overlapping in a tide of malice and memory. Mara's hand hovered over the glyphs, hesitant only for a heartbeat, then pressed firmly. The energy snapped, recoiling as though surprised, the heart thrumming with recognition and resistance at once. The adult screamed in frustration and fury, lashing out with brute strength that Mara evaded easily. She was small, yes, but in her movements there was cunning. And in her determination there was a power the forge could not consume. The core flared, and the shadows writhed, the voices reaching a crescendo. Mara's presence at the nexus seemed to command them, bending the chaos into a rhythm that the adults could no longer follow. Sparks coalesced, forming bridges across the molten channels, guiding the girls with a precision born of instinct. They crossed with her, the group now a single, cohesive force. And then the final test appeared, a figure taller than any adult, a monster of metal and flesh fused with energy that hummed and throbbed like a heartbeat. Its gaze swept over us, and for a moment it felt as if the forge itself had taken form, manifesting its own guardian. Mara didn't falter. She looked at it, really looked at it, and in that gaze there was no fear, only understanding. A choice presented itself, a path that could destroy them all or free the forge from its corruption. With a swift, precise motion, Mara reached for the control glyph again. The energy of the heart surged into her hands and she shaped it. She did not fight with brute force. She did not strike with hatred or revenge. Instead, she commanded the flow, redirecting the corrupted energy into a pattern that no adult could have conceived. The monstrous guardian shrieked, its body convulsing as the energy reformed around Mara's command, until finally it collapsed, inert and harmless. The forge itself trembled, then quieted, as though exhaling after a long and painful scream. The heart no longer pulsed with chaos. It throbbed with a new rhythm, one that recognized the cunning, bravery, and instinct of those small, unassuming hands that had dared to touch it. Mara stood at the center, breathless but triumphant, and the other girls looked to her with awe, understanding that she had become more than a leader. She had become a hero of their world. For the first time in memory, the forge exhaled without malice. The air shimmered less with danger and more with potential, as if even chaos had learned that courage could exist in forms it had not anticipated. The girls gathered around Mara, exhausted, dirty, but alive. And in that moment, they realized that what adults had failed to conquer, what horrors had seemed insurmountable, could be faced and overcome by the ingenuity and bravery of children who refused to be broken. The forge was quiet now, but not dead. It had learned a lesson, and Mara, small and fierce, understood that sometimes the most terrifying worlds were best faced not with power, but with courage, cleverness, and the unyielding hope of those who had nothing left to lose. The forge no longer roared with violence, yet its metal lungs still breathed heat and iron. Mara stood amidst the cooling conduits, the glow of molten channels reflecting in her wide, alert eyes. Around her, the other girls moved cautiously, touching levers and panels that once had been instruments of torment. Each interaction sent tremors through the machinery, yet none of it reacted with malice. The corruption had been bent, not destroyed, and in that careful balance lay the true lesson of the forge. Mara's small hands trembled as she traced the surface of a control glyph. The symbols pulsed faintly under her touch, almost as if they were acknowledging her. She didn't fully understand what she had done. Not the depths of the energy she had redirected. Not the way the heart of the forge had chosen to obey her. But she knew enough. She had survived where adults had failed. She had outwitted where strength had been useless. The sense of power was intoxicating yet frightening, for it carried responsibility heavier than any child should bear. The other girls began to speak in whispers, sharing their astonishment at what had occurred. They spoke of the monsters they had seen, the molten rivers, the twisted overseers who had struck with unthinking cruelty. They spoke of Mara's courage, how she had stood unflinching in the face of the forge's pulse, bending the chaos to her will. In those hushed voices there was awe, yes, but also a sense of relief. They were alive, and more than that, they were unbroken. From the shadows, remnants of the chaos machinery shifted uneasily. A few constructs, twisted by both metal and warp, tried to rise again, testing the pattern Mara had imposed. She watched them, narrowed her eyes, and without raising her voice, gestured. The energy of the heart, still humming faintly in the glyphs, responded, forming barriers that contained the constructs without harming them. Mara realized then that she could command, guide, and contain, not destroy, using the very force that had once sought to annihilate her. The girls moved as one, following Mara deeper into the central chamber of the forge. Here, the heart of corruption lay exposed, a massive nexus of metal, bone, and warp energy, throbbing like a wounded beast. Mara approached cautiously, feeling the heat on her skin and the pull in her chest as the pulse of the heart reached out to her. She placed her hand on the coldest section, the metal that was furthest from the molten rivers, and closed her eyes. For a moment the whispers returned, not of threats but of possibility. The forge seemed to speak in fragmented childlike tones, as though it too had learned that cruelty was not inevitable. And then came the sound that froze the girl's blood, the screeching approach of adult overseers who had survived the initial confrontation. They were massive, warped creatures of flesh and metal, and their eyes burned with fury and disbelief. They saw the children standing amidst their dominion, untouched, unbroken, and the rage that followed was raw and violent. Yet Mara did not flinch. She met the largest of them, the one whose body had been fused with a dozen failing engines, and simply stepped aside, guiding the others around the molten veins. The adult's attack struck only air and reflected fury, unable to adjust to the small, quick, and unpredictable movements of children who refused to play by the rules of brute force. The battle continued, though it was no longer a battle of death. Mara and the other girls navigated the forge with a cleverness born of necessity, each move redirecting energy, each footfall disturbing the constructs enough to keep them contained. The overseers faltered, confused and frustrated by the simplicity and ingenuity of those they had deemed powerless. The heart pulsed in rhythm with Mara's movements now, and for the first time it seemed almost sentient in recognition. Not chaos, not corruption, but acknowledgement. Finally, the overseers, exhausted and outmaneuvered, withdrew to the shadows. Their cries echoed, a mix of rage and confusion, fading as the girls reclaimed the forge. Mara stood in the center, hands resting lightly on the glyphs, and for a moment, everything was still. The heat, the pulse, the whispers, they all quieted, listening. And in that silence, the small girl who had faced the heart of corruption understood her place. She was not a victim, not a prisoner, not simply a survivor. She was the keeper of balance, a hero born from the horrors of a world that had sought to crush her spirit. The other girls gathered around her, eyes wide, hearts still racing from the terror and triumph. They did not need words. Mara's presence spoke for her. She had led them through chaos, had faced death and destruction with nothing but her courage, and had emerged not only alive, but victorious. In their shared gaze there was understanding, an unspoken promise that they would follow her, that they would endure together, and that they had glimpsed the possibility of hope even in the darkest forge the Imperium could conceal. The forge, now subdued but still alive, awaited the next choice. Mara's hands hovered over the glyphs again. What to do with power, what to do with the heart of corruption, was a question beyond simple childhood reasoning. Yet she felt its weight in her chest. This was not the end, but a beginning. The forge had been tamed but not claimed, and Mara, small, brave, and clever, understood that the choices ahead would shape not only her life, but the lives of all who had survived.